Less than a week after President Obama vetoed the 9/11 bill that would allow the victims of the September 11th terror attacks to sue Saudi Arabia, Congress overrode his veto. It's the first time that's happened in the entire 8 years of Obama's presidency. The Democrats don't like to challenge their top dog. Obama claimed the bill would put the friendship between the Saudis and the Americans at risk, but almost a dozen of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi nationals. And though the Saudis deny it, there is suspicion that Saudi businessmen or the government, it's basically one and the same there, helped fund the attack. That's the side Congress chose to take. But our next guest saw this coming. He said this wasn't the end of the Democrats' efforts to spike this deal, and he was right.
Obama vetoed a bill that would allow 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia for its alleged role in the terror attacks. The president sent this letter to the Senate saying he vetoed because U.S. courts should not determine if a foreign country is sponsoring terrorism. Also, he said that it opens up Americans to be hit with lawsuits in other countries. I asked Harry Reid, the Senate Minority Leader, if he was trying to get Democrats to back President Obama on the veto.
Well, we had a good discussion in the caucus today. I would, not a betting man being from Nevada, I would bet that Obama's veto will not be sustained.
Joining me now is former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Jim, you were right. This was a PR stunt.
It was, and of course, Senator Reid was the lone vote to uphold the president's veto, and I think he was just laying down a marker, sort of saying, we're going to reconsider this during the lame duck, and to quietly undo after we're past those voters what we made a big show of doing for the American people before the election.
Right, and we saw those headlines after that veto, or after the vote to override the veto, I should say, happened about Congress having so-called buyer's remorse. But I go back to our previous conversation. I think you were right. I don't think it's buyer's remorse. I think they had this planned all along because they knew the American people were watching their vote to see whether or not they would stand up for the victims of the 9/11 attack. But really, they're just out for their own gains. But Jim, the dangerous part of this is the new version of the bill that's in the works. Apparently, there are going to be accommodations to the Saudi Arabian government. Tell me about that.
Well, essentially what they want to do is make sure that the bill does not inconvenience the Saudis. And there are a number of ways you could do this in terms of limiting the jurisdiction of various lawsuits. But the easiest way would be to insert a presidential waiver where Obama, or whoever the next president is, can simply, with a stroke of the pen, saying, well, I certify the Saudis are cooperating with us in our anti-terrorism efforts and fighting religious extremism, and that then would legally block the suits, including retroactively some of the suits that have already been filed.
Well, then that would render this bill essentially useless then. It wouldn't even be part of the legislative branch anymore. It would be entirely under the jurisdiction of the president.
Exactly right, and that would be the intent of the fix. And that's why they laid so low and were so quiet and didn't fight this thing on the floor of the House or the Senate. I worked in the Senate for 17 years. When something comes to the floor of the Senate, there are amendments galore, you big floor fights. None of that here. Just like a hot knife through butter, and then we'll do the dirty work in the dark room after the election. Right,
and this I think is a good example of the real legacy of the Democrats over these past 8 years in the Obama administration. What they're doing is they're transferring almost every policy, every piece of legislation, every executive order. It's transferring power from the people, from the legislative branch, our representatives in Congress, to the president and his agencies, his unelected bureaucrats, to have power over us. Jim, let me ask you about the sovereign immunity part, because President Obama mentioned this in his letter to Congress. He mentioned essentially his worry that this would open up the United States to lawsuits from foreign countries, basically the opposite of what it would enable us to do from Saudi Arabia. Is this a valid concern of his?
Not in my opinion. To start with, we have waived sovereign immunity for any number of countries, simply putting them on the sponsors of terrorism list. So we've allowed lawsuits against Iran and Cuba and Iraq under the time of Saddam Hussein and so forth. That precedent already exists if you're worried about the precedent. On the other hand, the real reason other countries, which could enact a similar law in their own courts, anytime, whether we do so or not, is that they simply don't have the power to enforce those judgments. If the U.S. government gets sued in, say, Germany, How is Germany going to enforce that? They can't take money out of bank transfers the same way we can if we enforce a judgment against foreign governments. The disparity of power is just too great.
Right. So it's almost a matter of leverage, is what you're saying, that these other countries, they could, I guess, hypothetically, condemn the United States in their courts. But what are they actually going to do that hurts us? And the answer is nothing. That's why we haven't seen any significant lawsuits happen in this way. All right, Jim, final thing here, then translate this into everyday speak here. Why should the American people care about this? And I'm talking about those outside of the political realm who are not following it as closely as you are, perhaps. This doesn't seem like it would impact us in our day-to-day lives.
Well, I think the first thing is the J in JASTA, which is the word justice, justice for against sponsors of terrorism. That Americans were injured here, and if a government was complicit in that, they should be held accountable. And we're only talking about terrorist acts that happened in the United States. This is not a big broad brush. We're not, scouring the world to look for causes of action. This is only terrorism as defined under U.S. law happening in the United States. Why shouldn't a country, even one that pretends to be friendly, which in my opinion Saudi Arabia is not be held accountable for that?
Right, because like you said, that's just the basic definition of justice. All right, last question. What can we do then, the American people? How can we ensure that this quote-unquote fix doesn't actually go through?
Well, thankfully, lame duck sessions don't last very long. They last a few weeks at most, and sometimes much shorter than that. I don't know exactly when they may schedule one. That's always a question mark till after the election. But right now, if Americans call their senators and congressmen, especially their senators, it only takes one senator to put a hold on a bill. And if that's done during a lame duck session, that pretty much guarantees that they will not be able to pass new legislation, which is what they really need to do to revise this thing. So call your senators in particular and say, please put a hold on any revision to JASTA.
All right, well, there you have it. You heard him, guys. You heard the man. Call your senator. Tell him to stop because it will ensure the safety and security of the American people. Jim, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's always great to talk to you. Our next tipping point with Sagar and Jetty is Islamic State strategy. We'll be right back.